Here's an episode of How to Analyse Poetry from the Learning Cauldron. Today we'll be looking at Norman MacCaig's poem Assisi. Analysing poetry involves identifying and dissecting the literary techniques that the poet has used effectively to explore the theme or themes of a poem. In his poem Assisi, Norman MacCaig explores the themes of isolation, suffering, the hypocrisy of the church, and society's treatment of the poor and disabled. The title of the poem, Assisi, immediately gives us a clue to the setting. The word Assisi, which refers to a town in Italy, is also synonymous with Saint Francis of Assisi, the town's most famous son. Saint Francis was a man who gave up all his possessions and lived with the poor in order to understand their suffering. In the first line, the word dwarf immediately catches the reader's attention. It's perhaps not what we're expecting in a poem which appears to be about either St. Francis of Assisi or the town itself. It shocks us a little, and so does the second part of the line here, hands on backwards. This suggests that he is either deformed or that perhaps his hands are in a begging position. There are two interpretations of this. Then we move on to the next line where we have the sibilance of sat slumped like a half-filled sack. There's almost the impression here with the repeated S sound that the air is deflating from this person, just like air comes out of a bouncy castle as it deflates. And the idea of a sack which is half full gives us the impression of the top of the Hessian bag slumped over, just as the dwarf is. The word choice of tiny and twisted to describe his legs not only contain the alliteration of a short staccato t, emphasising how tiny they are, but also focuses us on the idea of them being twisted. The poor man is deformed. And this is continued when we have the enjambment leading from which onto sawdust. So the word sawdust is a focus, and this dehumanises the dwarf. We don't expect sawdust to come from a human being, but rather from perhaps a puppet or a doll. And then in the next line, we have the word choice of 3 tiers of churches. And this suggests a building that is extremely grandiose and extravagant. And then comes the irony. The enjambment emphasises that it is built in honour of Saint Francis, who we are told is the brother of the poor. So we have this fabulous contrast between the 3 tiers of churches, richness, and the person who wanted to stand up for the poor. Why build a church spending lots of money in honour of a man who would rather that the money had been spent on the poor and exactly the sort of person that this dwarf is? St. Francis is also said to be a talker with birds, emphasising his connection with nature and the animal kingdom and his gentleness. And then referring back to the dwarf again, we're told that he had the advantage over St. Francis of not being dead yet. And the sinister positioning of that word at the end hints at the idea that perhaps it won't be long before the dwarf is dead. Moving on to the second stanza, we have a reference straight away to the priest. We're now actually in the church, the Basilica of St. Francis, and here we have a representative of the church explaining how clever it was of the Italian painter Giotto to make his pictures on the walls, frescoes, tell stories that would reveal to the illiterate. Now this word choice is interesting. Illiterate refers to people who are not able to read and write, and that is exactly the sort of person that the dwarf who was outside is. And it's almost condescending and patronising, because he says that they at least will be able to understand the paintings, because they can't understand written form. Then we have an interesting enjambment, the goodness of God. And one has to question, we know that MacCaig was not a believer, he was not religious, and therefore he's emphasising what God could possibly create a creature who was suffering as much as this poor dwarf. We also have the harsh goodness and God, the guttural sound of the G's, which emphasises his sense of despair there. This is continued with the sibilant suffering of his son. Not only the Son of God suffered, the dwarf is also suffering, as MacCaig points out. And MacCaig, who's speaking in the first person voice, says, I understood the explanation and the cleverness. The enjambment here pausing before we have cleverness to show the ironic tone in the poem here. He does not believe it is clever for the man to be boasting about his knowledge of art, when instead he should be focusing his attentions on the poor dwarf outside. And then we move on to the third and final stanza. And here there's an interesting extended metaphor describing the tourists as clucking contentedly, comparing them to chickens who are not renowned for their intellect. And this is emphasised by the alliteration of C, clucking contentedly, almost emulating the sound of the chickens as they flutter after him as he scattered the grain of the word. And there's some lovely sound in here with the double T and the double T here, some consonants. We also have an interesting capital W here to remind us of the religious criticism that MacCaig is exercising here. He finds it intolerable that the church, which is supposed to support people like the dwarf, instead is busy entertaining the tourists effectively. And the word choice, a very simple word and easy to look over, but don't miss it. It was they who had passed the ruined temple outside. The they refers critically to these tourists who have ignored the dwarf in his hour of need. Another fabulous metaphor here, comparing the dwarf to a ruined temple. The idea of ruined is a building that is dilapidated and falling to pieces, and temple is a place worthy of worship and reverence. And what MacCaig is suggesting potentially here is that this man is worthy of our attention and respect. Even if he is ruined, apparently from the outside, we don't know what is inside. And that contrasts beautifully with the 3 tiers of churches that have been built in memory of St. Francis, who would have been far more interested in the money being spent on the ruined temple. The positioning here of eyes at the end of the line and then the enjambment to wept pus is shocking to us. There are 3 monosyllabic words here which makes this stand out. Eyes, wept, pus. Pus is a noxious substance and not something that you expect to come from what are said to be the gateway to the soul. And then the description of his physical deformity continues, his back higher than his head and his lopsided mouth. And then we have him saying grazie. Perhaps someone has given him some money. And the grazie reminds us of the setting, which is in Italy, but also it's a soft sound. And this soft sound continues with voice as sweet as a child's when she speaks to her mother, or a bird's when it spoke to Saint Francis. Soft and gentle, just like the voice of the dwarf. And perhaps this is unexpected because given his exterior appearance, one might have expected a gruff voice. And the image used to describe the voice as a child's when she speaks to her mother, as sweet as a child's when she speaks to her mother, shows the softness and gentleness and also refers to a child. And a child is a symbol of innocence, reminding us that this dwarf has never harmed anyone or done anything wrong. He is in this position through no fault of his own and is deserving of our pity and help. And here we come back to the concepts of birds and St. Francis, which were mentioned in the first stanza, reminding us again of what St. Francis stood for, standing up for birds and people who could not help themselves, as in the case of this dwarf. A very poignant and hard-hitting poem and a reflection on the hypocrisy of the church. I hope that's been helpful. See you next time.